So yesterday I talked about a PlayStation 5 patent that had been made public, and what it showed was the inside of that PlayStation development kit. The one that we saw that looks like a space hangar, right? It was pretty cool looking when we first saw it. Then we saw renders and they made it glow blue and all this stuff. And then eventually pictures leaked out of people like taking it with their cell phones. And it's a very odd looking system. And to be honest, when I first saw it, I kind of had in my mind what they were doing inside of the system to cool it. And I didn't really think too much of it. I just thought, okay, that's to stack it. And there must be a chip in there that they're just cooling in this weird like V-shaped dual heatsink thing. I didn't give it too much thought. I even figured, okay, maybe on like the left side, they have a Zen 2 CPU, and then on the right side, they have something with an RDNA GPU that could even be overclocked because RDNA 2 wasn't ready, and they were trying to get close to that. Essentially, I didn't really consider what is actually inside of this system. It is odd, but the more I thought about it yesterday, the more I continued to go back to what Mark Cerny was saying during his GDC talk that he had, where he mentioned that they were going to be changing the way that the system dealt with power usage and how it would change frequency on the fly. And it started to kind of come together for me to where I kind of think that this dev kit, believe it or not, is giving us an early look at how the PlayStation 5 is going to look. So yes, we are going into massive speculation territory here, but it was pretty interesting, and I just wanted to kind of talk through it here with you so you can see where I'm getting at, and you can let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. So if you enjoy it, make sure you guys like the video on the way out. Okay, so let's go over here. This is the entire page that shows the patent and the images, and I'll link it down below. But we can see right here, this is the main dev kit unit that we're going to be looking at. I will tell you, I have spoken to some, and it looks like that the dev kits have been essentially upgraded. They've been updated for them, and they've had new dev kits, it seems, that are getting closer, I think, to the overall retail unit and what specs and parts they will have. So parts have become more and more available, of course, like whether it's RDNA 2 chips or whatnot. So most likely this dev kit is not being used as prominently as newer development kits, but I still think the overall structure is the same. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why that is. So we had this image here. This is for the main dev kit from the outside. And if we go over here, we can start to see the top of it, and they show us how the airflow works, which is kind of neat because the way it seems to work is while it does push air out the sides, because the way that it is funneled, and it almost like does this little spinning motion here, it ends up shooting out the back of the kit. And of course, the dev kits are designed to be stacked, so you can have multiple just kind of stacked up there, and then they all push air out through the back. Interesting design for that to take place. But when we get over here and we start looking inside of it, you'll notice something, and this is what has been pointed out by a lot of people, and that is the fact that there are 6 fans. That's right, 6 fans. That is a lot. Okay, has quite a few fans to be in anything. Like in a system like this, what's a dev kit for a console, it is quite a few. And I think people are looking at this and now thinking that 6 fans will be inside the PlayStation 5 system. I don't believe that. I think the maximum amount of fans you'll see in the PS5, and this is, again, a guess, I think it's just going to be 2. That'd be the most. And 1 is also still very possible. But the reason I think 2 will exist is because I think Sony, at this point, is looking to actively cool 2 components here. All right? That's the biggest thing. Generally, in like the PlayStation 4 or the PlayStation 4 Pro, there's just been 1 fan, and it has a job of cooling basically the entire system. And that hasn't really worked out for Sony much at all. In fact, they've always had 1 fan now that I think about it. The PS2 had a fan, just 1. The PS3 probably could have used an extra fan, but it just had 1. I think this is going to be a pretty big shift for Sony, and like I said, Mark Cerny described it as best as he could during his keynote. Now, during this time, it was described that the PlayStation 5 is given a set power budget tied to the thermal limits of the cooling assembly. Mark Cerny himself said rather than running at constant frequency and letting the power vary based on the workload, we run at essentially constant power and let the frequency vary based on the workload. And the interesting thing about this is these systems like the PS4, the PS4 Pro, the power supply is still cooled in those systems. Here is an image from iFixit where they were disassembling the PS4. And I just wanted to use this as a guide, so a visual aid, so I can show you. This is for the PlayStation 4 Pro, which gets pretty loud, right? But you can see the power supply in the back here, and they are kind of lifting that out, and you can see the heatsink directly in front of it with a vent through the power supply where several components are, and then the air eventually gets to the back of the system. But it has one fan that pushes through the heatsink, and then the power supply is an afterthought when it comes to cooling, since it's getting warmer air, since that is going through a heatsink that is cooling the entire chip. Now, if we come back to this image here, we have two components that are being cooled. So there's three fans on each side. And on the left side, there is a very large vapor chamber as it's described. So basically what's in the Xbox One X. And that makes sense to me that they would use that. They're not going to do some crazy tubed water cooling or anything like that. The vapor chamber design, it worked fine in the Xbox One X. They might as well use it in the PlayStation 5 as well. Why not? So the left side is pretty straightforward. You have a heatsink. It appears that they are using a pull setup for their fans where air will be pushed or pulled out the back of it and then pulled through the heatsink. It will funnel through the side and then eventually come out of the back on that end. That works. But the other side is interesting because it is just the power supply. So they are going to dedicate what appears to be 3 fans just in this development kit to the power supply, and that makes me wonder if that is how they will also do it in the final product. I mean, we've had some systems use a fan specifically for a power supply, and those typically end up being external because when they bring the power supply internal, they can kind of feed off of the fan, as we just saw with the PS4 Pro, but the Xbox 360 had a fan inside of its power supply, and the Xbox One also, the original, the original VCR model, before they took the power supply and moved it inside of the system with the S, that had a fan inside as well. I've had them come in to the store when they were broken, and that's of course because you're gonna put it on the floor, on the carpet, it ends up pulling in all kinds of dirt and dust and even hair, and it would get busted up, and you could even hear fan whine at times inside of it, and that actually was, I think, one of the reasons why they decided to eventually make the power supply internal, but it was never a main focus like this when it comes to the active cooling, and they even have an entire cooling zone just for that power supply. And that kind of leans into what Mark Cerny is describing, where the system itself is given a certain budget when it comes to power within its thermal limits. So they will pretty much know what that power supply is going to put out in terms of heat at all times, and as long as they have the correct cooling in there with the fans running at the correct speeds that really shouldn't be ramping up or down because they will have an idea, then you would come out with a fairly quiet system, and you wouldn't need the fans on the other side that may actively move depending on the frequency. That would be questionable as well, because this is kind of, for PlayStation, and it would even be for Xbox, new territory. It's going to be really interesting to see how all of this works out. And I mean, it can't be any worse than the PS4 Pro. I just think it is really cool the way that they are making this work, where the power supply is going to take a heavy amount of focus for the cooling aspect. I mean, you can see the top-down look here. They have a shroud, of course, for both sides. So we have our heatsink here and our power supply here, and it's all designed to pull air in through the front, dead center, with the heat sinks being very, very close on this side, and then the power supply on this side, very close to just the outside of the system. I like the design, actually, the way that they are doing this. It's very practical. Now, They, of course, would want to dress this up if they do want to sell this to consumers eventually on retail shelves. But I gotta tell you, I would not be surprised if this V shape was in the retail unit. I think they might be able to flatten it somewhat, dress it up. Maybe they'll just make it like, I mean, there is a rumor right now that the system itself is thicker than the PlayStation 4 Pro, but it is still a rectangular box, and it's possible that it's thicker because they would still go with this V-shaped design, and I think that would be a good way to go if they do want to have two active cooling zones, one for the heatsink and one for the power supply. Keep in mind, we also saw that split heatsink design, and maybe they go with something like that as well, where they, instead of go from side to side, they kind of have one on top and one on bottom for active cooling on the CPU GPU combo and then on the power supply. But I think this V shape might be the way to go. But let me know what you guys think about this idea. It was just something I was thinking when I was going through it, that they could have just two active cooling zones. They could have a fan on either side, and something they could do is have a fan maybe in the front on either side and just push air straight through to the back. That could be a way that they could go about it. They could still also have fans that, instead of being on either sides, maybe are just like down in the front and they just push air down and around like they do with the PS4. There's a lot of things they could do, but I'm seriously starting to get more and more sold on this design, just changed up slightly for when they put it on retail store shelves. Interesting stuff there. And who knows, maybe in the next week or so, we will see the PS5. Of course, they delayed their event. I kind of think we will see the console there, but just keep this in mind. If we see it and it looks like this here, the dev kit, and now that we've seen the inside, it's because they are trying something very, very different for a console in terms of cooling and power management, and I'm going to be fascinated to see how this turns out. Really, really will be. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.